It began on a cold morning near the edge of a ruined French village, where silence hung heavier than the smoke drifting over shattered roofs. A British patrol moved cautiously through the rubble, rifles raised, boots crunching over broken stone. The fighting the night before had been fierce, one more clash in a war that had already swallowed too many days, too many men, too many lives. Among the debris of an abandoned German position lay scattered helmets, torn documents, and the remains of hurried retreat. Most British soldiers kept their focus on the path ahead, but one sergeant noticed something unusual half buried beneath a collapsed wooden beam. A small leather-bound book, charred along the edges, its strap snapped clean through. A diary. He lifted it cautiously, brushing away soot. The cover was worn, the pages stiff with dried mud and smoke. He didn't expect it to mean anything. Diaries found on the battlefield often contained little more than rations lists, coordinates, or personal notes too vague to matter. But when he opened it, the first line stopped him. "If I die, let whoever finds this know that I never wanted this war." The words hit him with a force no bullet could match. He turned the page. More entries. Names of fallen friends. Fears whispered into pages because they could not be spoken aloud. Regret. Doubt. A longing for home. A confession that the soldier had grown tired of orders he no longer believed in. The sergeant read silently, each sentence cracking the image he carried of the enemy. A machine, relentless, willing, eager. But the writing in front of him didn't belong to a machine. It belonged to a young man who sounded painfully familiar. A man like any of them. Soon the rest of the patrol gathered around. Hard men with hardened expressions, now standing still, listening as the sergeant read a stranger's private words. And in that broken village, surrounded by ruin, these soldiers felt something unexpected: recognition. The war had taught them to hate the enemy. The diary forced them to see the human being inside the uniform. To understand why a small diary found in the ruins of a French village could shake hardened British soldiers, you must understand the world they had been living in, the exhaustion, the assumptions, the relentless grind of a war that had stripped men down to instinct. It was 1944 months after the Normandy landings. British forces were pushing eastward through France, village by village, field by field. The pace was grueling. Progress was measured not in miles, but in the number of men lost securing each bend in the road, each cluster of farmhouses, each ridge overlooking a shallow river. After years of conflict, the men had grown accustomed to seeing German soldiers as a single faceless force, disciplined, determined, and often frighteningly efficient. They didn't think about who those men were. They didn't want to. War required simplicity, them and us. Anything more complicated than that made survival harder. But the Germans had their own story, one most Allied soldiers never witnessed up close. In that same region, months earlier, a young German infantryman had been deployed with his unit. The war had drained him long before he stepped onto French soil. He had watched friends fall in Russia. He had marched through frozen winters. He had eaten rations too small for a growing boy, let alone a soldier in constant motion. Yet the orders kept coming, and he kept obeying them, because that was all he knew how to do. He began keeping a diary after losing his closest friend at the Eastern Front. Writing became the only place where he could admit what he couldn't say aloud: that he felt fear, that he felt guilt, that he wasn't sure what the war meant anymore. He wrote about missing the trees near his hometown, the bread his mother baked on Sundays, the way the river near his house froze every January. He wrote to remember he was human. When his unit was transferred west to reinforce positions against the advancing Allies, he carried the diary with him tied inside his coat. Even as morale crumbled, he wrote. Even as they retreated village after village, he wrote. Even as they dug trenches in frozen mud and slept under artillery fire, he wrote. And the British soldiers who now stood in that ruined village had no idea that the entry they were reading had been written just days earlier, by a man who feared he would soon die not as a villain, but as a forgotten young soldier whose story would vanish beneath the weight of history. The village itself had been contested for weeks. British and German forces clashed repeatedly through narrow streets and shattered fields. Civilians had fled long before, leaving behind empty houses with broken shutters and overturned furniture. The war had spread through the town like a disease. The British patrol came through only after the German lines finally faltered. They expected to find abandoned ammunition, perhaps a body or two, the usual signs of hasty withdrawal. They didn't expect to find something fragile, something that didn't belong in a place built from fear and fire. The sergeant who picked up the diary wasn't a sentimental man. He had survived Dunkirk, North Africa, and Normandy. He had buried friends in every campaign. He rarely allowed himself the luxury of reflection. But as he stood in that village, reading the words of someone he had been trained to fight, something shifted. His men gathered around quietly, listening as he read entry after entry. Words filled with longing and dread, hopes born in the dark, and questions about the war that echoed silently in their own minds. None of them had expected to feel anything like kinship. Yet with every page, the idea of the enemy became less clear. The German soldier wrote about missing his family. So did they. He wrote about moments of terror. They knew those moments too. He wrote about not wanting to kill. Many of them had felt the same. The diary did not excuse the war. It did not erase atrocities. But it cracked a wall that had been built over years of training and loss. And standing in that ruined village, the British soldiers realized they suddenly wanted to know more. About the man, about his story, about how something so fragile had survived when so many men hadn't. The diary didn't stay in the sergeant's hands for long. Once he finished the first few pages, he passed it to another soldier, who read silently. Then another. Soon the entire patrol stood in a small circle, each man waiting his turn. These were soldiers who had marched through hell, who had seen too much to be shaken by words on paper, but the deeper they read, the more the battlefield around them felt changed. What unsettled them wasn't the writing itself. It was how familiar the thoughts were. The German soldier wrote about fear during night patrols, about losing comrades suddenly, about feeling responsible for deaths he couldn't prevent. He wrote about hunger, sleeplessness, the constant weight of orders that didn't make sense anymore. He wrote about wanting to survive, not for honor, not for victory, but simply to go home and touch the earth of his village again. One line struck a British corporal hard enough that he had to stop reading. "I shoot because they tell me to shoot. But every time I do, I feel less like myself." The corporal closed the diary and stared at the ruined street. He had felt that same hollowing. Many had. The diary continued with memories, the soldier sister's laughter, the smell of pine forests back home, the river near his town, the cold mornings he used to hate now becoming something he longed for. He wrote with honesty, with vulnerability, with the voice of someone who had been drowning for too long. But then the entries grew darker. He wrote about a failed counterattack, about losing almost his entire squad, about waking up every morning unsure whether he could take another step, about questioning whether he still believed in the cause. One entry chilled the British men more than any gunshot. "If the people I am told to hate are men like me, then what is this war turning us into?" The sergeant reread that line twice. Something inside him tightened. Before they could finish the diary, the patrol commander arrived with urgent news. The Germans had fallen back to the next ridge, but a small group had been cut off during the retreat. They were believed to be hiding somewhere near the village outskirts, armed, frightened, and likely to fight if cornered. A patrol was needed to investigate. The sergeant placed the diary inside his coat. He didn't know why, but he felt compelled to keep it with him. The British soldiers moved out cautiously, navigating through collapsed walls and frozen mud. The wind cut through their uniforms, carrying the distant rumble of artillery. They approached an old barn at the edge of the village, the only structure still partially standing. Inside, they found them. 3 German soldiers. Young, exhausted, cornered. 2 held rifles, though their hands trembled. The third sat on the ground, a bandage wrapped around his leg, his face pale with pain. For a brief moment, both sides froze. The Germans expected immediate hostility. The British expected resistance. But what happened next surprised them all. One of the German soldiers spoke, his voice weak, cracked. "Please, no more." It wasn't a surrender command. It wasn't a plea for mercy. It was the voice of someone who had reached the end of everything. The British corporal, the same man who had read the diary line about losing oneself, slowly lowered his rifle. The others followed. The Germans hesitated, then dropped their weapons without protest. The sergeant stepped forward. He wasn't sure what he would find, but he had to ask. "Your unit," he said. "Who was your diarist?" The Germans looked confused. The sergeant took out the leather-bound book and held it up. The reaction was immediate. The wounded German's eyes widened. His breath hitched. He blinked hard, emotion shaking him. That was his," he whispered. "His who?" the sergeant asked. The German swallowed. "He was my friend." The barn grew still. The British soldiers waited. The German continued, voice trembling. "He died 2 nights ago. Mortar fire." He took a shallow breath. "I thought the diary burned with him." The sergeant looked at the book again. Suddenly it felt heavier. The wounded German lifted a shaking hand toward the diary, not to take it, but to touch it lightly, as if it were the last piece of someone he wasn't ready to lose. "He wrote in it every night," the German murmured. "Said it was the only way he remembered who he was. He wanted people to know he wasn't a monster." The British soldiers absorbed those words in silence. The Germans weren't trying to deceive them. They weren't trying to escape. They were simply young men carrying grief too heavy for their age. The sergeant, who had seen more battles than he cared to remember, felt something shift inside him. A crack in the hard shell war had forced around his heart. Before they could speak further, machine gun fire erupted from the far side of the ridge. The retreating Germans were making a last stand. The British unit was ordered to assist. The wounded German flinched with each distant burst. The sergeant made a decision. "You 3 stay here," he said firmly. "We'll return." The Germans nodded quietly. None attempted to flee. The British patrol moved out again, but the weight of the diary, and the story behind it, followed them. They fought through the ridge skirmish with a different perspective. They no longer saw faceless enemies in the German trenches, only men who might have written the same fears, the same doubts, the same longing. The fighting lasted nearly an hour. When it ended, the ridge was secured. As the British soldiers walked back toward the barn, the sergeant held the diary close, realizing that the words inside it had already changed everything about the way he saw this war. And something even more unexpected awaited them when they returned to the village. When the British patrol returned to the barn, they expected to find the 3 German stragglers right where they had left them. Quiet, exhausted, waiting under guard. But the moment they entered the clearing, something felt different. The barn door was open. The cold wind carried a stillness that didn't feel like danger, it felt like anticipation. The sergeant stepped inside first. The 3 Germans were standing, not in surrender, not in fear, but in a solemn line as if they had prepared themselves for something they knew needed to happen. The wounded soldier leaned heavily on a broken beam, his face pale, but his eyes steady. And something else was there on a crate in front of them. The diary. Opened. Pages exposed. Placed carefully, as if they were presenting it back to the sergeant. The sergeant approached, confusion tightening his chest. One of the Germans spoke softly. "You should keep it." The sergeant blinked. "Why?" The soldier's voice shook, but not from fear. "Because he wanted someone to understand." The wounded German added, "And you did." The British troops, hardened by years of conflict, stood unusually still. There was no tension, no malice. Only a quiet human exchange taking shape in a place built for violence. The sergeant picked up the diary. It was heavier now. Full of meaning it hadn't held the first time he read it. Another distant burst of artillery rumbled across the countryside. It reminded them all that the war was still raging, that men were still dying only miles away. But inside this crumbling barn, something had shifted, a fragile piece carved out of exhaustion and shared sorrow. The sergeant looked at the Germans and asked gently, "Tell me about him." The wounded soldier exhaled shakily, as though he had been waiting for that question. "He was quiet," he began. "Always writing. Even when we were surrounded, even during bombardments. He wrote because he said talking didn't help anymore. Another added, he hated the war. Not the people. Just the war. He said if he didn't write, he would forget who he was. The sergeant swallowed. He had heard similar sentiments from British men in the trenches across Africa, Italy, and France. Soldiers teaching themselves to remain human in a place designed to strip humanity away. The German continued, when he died, I wanted to keep his diary safe. But everything was burning. I had to run. I thought it was lost. The sergeant opened the diary again. His rough hands brushed against the fragile pages. The words glared back at him. Fears, confessions, memories. Every line carried the voice of a young man whose story almost vanished in smoke. Then came the moment no one expected. The wounded German stepped forward, bowing his head, not in defeat, but in sincerity. His voice cracked. Thank you for reading it. The British soldiers exchanged glances. Gratitude from an enemy soldier was not something they were prepared for. It was as disarming as any ambush. One British corporal finally broke the silence. He wasn't the only one who felt that way, he said quietly. We all did. We just never wrote it down. The German soldier lifted his eyes, stunned that an enemy would admit something so vulnerable. The barn seemed to breathe with a shared truth neither side had been allowed to say out loud. Then an officer's whistle echoed from outside. A British lieutenant entered the barn. We've secured the area, he announced. Prisoners need to be moved. The Germans stiffened. Even peaceful surrender came with uncertainty. But the lieutenant noticed the diary in the sergeant's hands and something softened in his expression. You found something important? He asked. The sergeant nodded once. More than I expected. The lieutenant studied the Germans, 3 young men who looked more like weary farm boys than the terrifying enemy propaganda had painted. He gave the sergeant a slow nod. Treat them properly, he ordered quietly. They've seen enough. The British soldiers escorted the Germans out into the cold. No pushing, no ravnis. Just quiet steps through the ruined village. The wounded soldier struggled to walk. Without hesitation, the same corporal who had lowered his rifle earlier moved to support him. The German hesitated for a breath, then accepted the help gratefully. It was a small act, barely visible against the vastness of the war, yet monumental in meaning. As they began the walk toward the collection point, the sergeant held the diary close to his chest. He didn't know what he would do with it yet. But he knew one thing. He could no longer see the enemy the same way. The war still raged. Orders were still orders. But this diary had carved a new space inside him, one where he could acknowledge something the war had tried to erase. Their enemy wasn't made entirely of hatred. It was made of men who were afraid, longing, human. And as the patrol moved through the ruins of the village, the sergeant realized the diary had not just changed his understanding of the war. It had changed him. The prisoners were escorted through the frost-bitten streets of the ruined village, their steps slow and uncertain. The British soldiers walked alongside them, no longer seeing shadows of threat behind every movement. The war had not changed. The battlefield had not changed. But the way they viewed the men walking with them had shifted forever. When they reached the temporary collection point, a small clearing reinforced with sandbags and camouflage netting, the prisoners were processed quietly. Names recorded. Ranks noted. Weapons removed. The standard procedure. Yet it felt different now. Not mechanical, not cold, but weighted with an unspoken understanding. The diary remained in the sergeant's coat. He felt its presence constantly, every rustle of paper against cloth reminding him of the voice inside. Honest, frightened, painfully human. Later that afternoon, as the sky dimmed over the ridge and the village settled into another uneasy quiet, he sat on a broken stone wall and opened the diary again. He didn't begin at the first page. He turned to the last entry, written in messy handwriting, as if the soldier had been interrupted or writing in poor light. If someone finds this, I hope they see that I was just a man trying to survive a war I never wanted. The sergeant closed the book slowly. He had fought across continents. He had buried friends. He had hated the enemy because hate was easier than thinking. But now, with one fragile diary resting in his hands, he understood something deeper. Most men on both sides were simply trying to endure forces too large for them to control. Hours later, a British officer approached him. "HQ wants any documents collected from the German positions," he said. The sergeant hesitated. For a brief moment, he considered handing the diary over. It was, after all, standard protocol. But then he looked toward the German prisoners, 3 young men sitting together under a canvas sheet, speaking quietly, their faces drawn with equal parts fatigue and relief. He remembered the wounded one whispering that the diarist was his friend. He remembered the bow, the gratitude, the heartbreak in their voices. And he realized the diary didn't belong in a box of captured papers. It belonged somewhere it would be understood. He shook his head. "No useful intel in this one," he lied softly. The officer nodded and walked off without question. When the sun finally dipped beneath the ruins of the village, the British camp settled for the night. Fires flickered quietly. The sound of boots softened. And in the blue-gray dusk, the sergeant approached the prisoners one last time. The wounded German looked up, startled. The sergeant held out the diary. For a long moment, nobody moved. Then the wounded soldier reached out with trembling fingers and accepted it as though receiving the last remaining piece of his fallen friend. He whispered something in German, too soft to understand, but the emotion behind it needed no translation. The sergeant nodded once, stepped back, and turned away. He didn't need thanks. He didn't need words. He simply needed to leave the diary with the people who felt its weight most deeply. As he walked back toward the British lines, he felt unexpectedly lighter. Not because the war was ending, not because the struggle was over, but because the diary had reminded him of something war had tried to erase. The enemy was not always the monster he imagined. Sometimes the enemy was just a young man with a notebook full of fears. And in that fading twilight, the ruined village seemed to breathe quietly again, as if it, too, understood. In the silence that followed, the soldiers remembered everything.